September 3rd, 1260. Dawn breaks over a narrow valley in northern Palestine, the first light spilling across dry grass and broken stone. A Mamluk general reins in his horse at the edge of the hills and looks down at the open plain below. In a few hours, he and a few thousand cavalry will face an army that has erased cities from the map and rewritten the borders of continents. The Mongols have crushed empires from China to Eastern Europe. Baghdad burned. Damascus surrendered. For more than 50 years, no power on earth has stopped them for long. They move faster than anyone. They fight smarter than anyone. And everywhere they go, resistance ends the same way, in smoke, rubble, and silence. By every metric that matters, mobility, discipline, psychological warfare, this battle should be over before it begins. But the general isn't staring at the enemy. He's studying the ground beneath his horse's hooves, the rocky slopes, the narrowing valley, the thin patches of grass. Because the real weapon today isn't a sword, or a bow, or superior numbers. It's terrain. What happened next isn't the version of history most people know. And it wasn't brute force that broke the Mongol myth of invincibility, it was strategy, timing, and the quiet power of the landscape itself. If you're the kind of person who believes the smartest player in the room doesn't always look the strongest, you're going to appreciate this story. Because what happened in that valley wasn't about brute force, it was about leverage. About understanding the system better than your opponent. About using constraints as an advantage. If that's your kind of thinking, make sure you're subscribed. These are the kinds of stories we break down here, the moments where strategy beats scale, where positioning beats power, and where geography quietly decides the fate of empires. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because some of the most important turning points in history are the ones no one saw coming. Now, to understand how a relatively young sultanate dared to confront the most feared military machine on earth, we need to rewind 2 years. Back to 1258. Back to a city that had stood as the intellectual and spiritual center of the Islamic world for 5 centuries. Back to Baghdad, just before the Mongols arrived and proved to everyone that their dominance was not a myth, but a brutal, unstoppable reality. To understand why the stand at Ain Jalut felt almost irrational, you have to step into the mindset of the 13th century and see the Mongols the way the world saw them then, not as just another rising power, but as a force of nature. In 1258, Baghdad had stood for 5 centuries as one of the great capitals of civilization. It wasn't just a political center, it was an engine of ideas. Scholars gathered there to debate mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy. Libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, centuries of accumulated knowledge from Greece, Persia, India, and the Islamic world. The Abbasid Caliph ruled from its palaces, recognized as a spiritual authority by millions stretching from Spain to the borders of India. Then Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, arrived with an army that modern historians estimate in the 6 figures. The Caliph miscalculated. He believed his walls were strong enough. He believed his status would shield him. He believed, perhaps, that negotiation was still an option. It wasn't. When Baghdad fell in February 1258, the Mongols didn't just occupy the city, they dismantled it. Chroniclers wrote that so many books were thrown into the Tigris that the river ran black with ink. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out. The Caliph himself was executed. Whether the death toll was in the hundreds of thousands or more, what mattered was the signal. The intellectual capital of the Islamic world had been erased in days. And the Mongols moved on. That's the part that terrified people most. There was no pause. No consolidation phase that looked like weakness. No sign of exhaustion. Baghdad was just another milestone in a campaign that had already redrawn the map of Eurasia. From the moment Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes in 1206, the expansion had been relentless. Northern China fell. The Jin dynasty collapsed. The Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia was annihilated. Russian principalities were shattered. Mongol cavalry rode into Poland and Hungary, defeating European armies that had never faced anything like them. By the mid-13th century, they controlled the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Eastern Europe. If you were a ruler watching this from a distant court, the pattern was clear. Resist, and you were destroyed. Submit quickly, and you might survive as a vassal. Those were the options, and it wasn't just their brutality that made resistance feel futile. It was their system. Most medieval armies were constrained by logistics. Heavy supply wagons. Slow-moving infantry. Campaign seasons dictated by harvest cycles. Roads determined movement. Armies moved like corporations with bloated overhead, powerful, but slow and predictable. The Mongols were different. Their entire model was built around mobility. A Mongol warrior didn't just own a horse, he lived on horseback. From childhood, he trained to ride, shoot, hunt, and navigate across vast distances. On campaign, each cavalryman brought multiple remounts, often 3 or 4 horses. When one tired, he switched. While a European army might cover 20 to 30 miles in a day under ideal conditions, Mongol forces could double that. They could appear where no one thought an army could reach, strike, and vanish before a counterattack could form. Their horses were small but resilient, adapted to the harsh steppe. They survived on sparse grass, endured extreme temperatures, and required minimal supply chains. Mongol warriors could sustain themselves off dried meat, fermented mare's milk, even drawing blood from their horses in emergencies. No heavy baggage train. No long logistical tail to protect. Think about the strategic implications. If your competitors move twice as fast as you, operate with half the overhead, and don't depend on traditional infrastructure, your defensive assumptions collapse. Fortified cities meant less when the enemy could bypass them, cut off supply lines, or simply choose the battlefield. Their battlefield tactics amplified that advantage. Units were organized with mathematical precision into groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Orders flowed efficiently. Maneuvers were coordinated. One of their signature strategies, the feigned retreat, became legendary. They would engage, appear to break, lure opponents into pursuit, then wheel around and envelop the disorganized enemy. It worked against heavily armored knights, disciplined infantry, and rival steppe nomads alike. Over decades, they refined this model. Tactical defeats happened, but they adapted. Learned. Returned stronger. So by 1260, after Baghdad had fallen and Damascus had opened its gates without a fight, the narrative was entrenched. The Mongols were unstoppable. Not because they never lost a skirmish, but because they always came back, and eventually crushed anyone who opposed them. For rulers across the Middle East, the calculus was brutally simple. If Baghdad couldn't survive, what chance did anyone else have? If China, Russia, and parts of Europe had already fallen, why would Egypt be different? That sense of inevitability was their greatest weapon. Before a single arrow flew, half the battle was psychological. Cities surrendered because they assumed resistance was irrational. Leaders convinced themselves that submission was pragmatism, and yet, beneath all of this dominance, there was a dependency, one that most of their enemies didn't fully understand. The Mongol system worked because of speed. Speed depended on horses. Horses depended on grass, terrain, and open space. Their empire was built on the ecology of the Eurasian steppe, vast plains, soft ground, endless grazing. Mobility was their superpower, but like any competitive advantage, it was context dependent. And context, as it turned out, was about to change. If you strip away the mythology, the Mongol advantage wasn't mystical. It was structural. Their real secret weapon wasn't a single innovation, it was an integrated system built around the horse. A Mongol warrior didn't just ride occasionally. He grew up in the saddle. From early childhood, boys were taught to mount before they could fully walk long distances. Riding wasn't a skill, it was a default state. They hunted on horseback, fought on horseback, traveled on horseback. By adolescence, many could fire arrows accurately at full gallop, twist in the saddle to shoot behind them, and maintain balance over rough terrain that would unseat most trained cavalry elsewhere. To outside observers, they looked fused to their mounts, man and animal functioning as one organism. That intimacy mattered. It meant their cavalry wasn't just transportation, it was a weapons platform. Then there was the remount system, which might be the closest thing the medieval world had to force multiplication. A typical Mongol cavalryman brought multiple horses on campaign, often 3 or 4, sometimes more. While one horse carried him into battle, the others traveled alongside, lightly burdened. When a mount tired, he switched. No downtime. No waiting for animals to recover. The army maintained momentum. In practical terms, this meant Mongol forces could cover 50 to 60 miles in a single day under favorable conditions, distances that would exhaust most European or Middle Eastern armies. Speed isn't just about movement, it's about options. They could choose when and where to engage. They could retreat and reappear unexpectedly. They could strike supply lines hundreds of miles away. To their enemies, they seemed omnipresent. The logistics model reinforced this advantage. Most medieval armies were chained to supply wagons. Food, fodder, siege equipment, everything moved slowly behind them. Those supply trains were vulnerable and required protection, which further slowed the army. Campaigns were constrained by roads, harvest cycles, and access to markets. The Mongols inverted that model. Their horses grazed as they moved. The warriors carried dried meat, fermented mare's milk, and minimal gear. In emergencies, they could draw small amounts of blood from their horses for sustenance without killing the animal. It sounds extreme, but it meant they didn't depend on long, fragile supply lines. No heavy baggage. No predictable route tied to infrastructure. For modern entrepreneurs, it's the difference between a lean startup and a legacy corporation weighed down by overhead. The Mongol army was asset-light, decentralized, and optimized for agility. They didn't need perfect roads or friendly cities. They needed grass and open space. That operational flexibility fed directly into their battlefield tactics. The Mongol army was organized using a decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Command flowed cleanly through the ranks. Maneuvers weren't chaotic charges driven by individual glory, they were coordinated movements executed with discipline. One of their most devastating techniques was the feigned retreat. On paper, it looked simple. Engage the enemy with light cavalry and archers. Harass them. Fire volleys from composite bows powerful enough to penetrate armor. Then, at the right moment, turn and flee. To a conventional army, this looked like victory. Opponents, especially heavily armored knights or ambitious princes, would break formation to pursue what appeared to be a routed enemy. Lines stretched thin. Units separated. Cohesion dissolved. That's when the Mongols pivoted. While retreating, they would twist in their saddles and fire backward, a maneuver sometimes called the Parthian shot. Hidden reserves would wheel around and strike the flanks. What began as a pursuit became an encirclement. The enemy found themselves attacked from multiple directions, disorganized and exhausted. This wasn't improvisation. It was rehearsed, repeated, and refined over decades. And it worked across continents because it exploited a universal human weakness, overconfidence in the moment of perceived victory. Layered on top of that was psychological warfare. The Mongols cultivated a brand, one built on ruthless consistency. Cities that surrendered quickly were often spared. Local rulers were allowed to remain as administrators under Mongol authority. Trade resumed. Stability returned. But cities that resisted were made examples. Entire populations were massacred. Infrastructure was destroyed. Word spread rapidly. Refugees carried stories ahead of the advancing armies. By the time Mongol envoys arrived demanding submission, many cities had already decided that resistance was suicidal. Terror wasn't random, it was strategic. It reduced the need for prolonged sieges and costly battles. In many cases, the Mongols won before fighting even began. A powerful example of their method unfolded at the Battle of the Kalkar River in 1223. A coalition of Russian princes, backed by Cuman allies, confronted a Mongol force on the steppes. Confident in their numbers, the Russians pursued what they believed was a retreating enemy. For days, nearly a week, they chased the Mongols across open terrain. But the retreat was deliberate. The Mongols drew them farther from support, stretching their lines, exhausting their horses. When the trap finally closed, the Russians were strung out and vulnerable. The Mongols turned, encircled them, and annihilated the coalition. Chroniclers describe devastating losses. The message was unmistakable: superior numbers meant nothing if you played by the wrong rules. By the time Mongol forces advanced into the Middle East, this pattern had repeated again and again. China, Central Asia, Russia, Eastern Europe. Each region had its own military traditions, its own strengths, and each had fallen to the same adaptable system. So when news spread that a Mongol army was approaching Egypt, the assumption wasn't whether they would win. It was how long resistance would last. Their cavalry system delivered speed. Their remount strategy delivered endurance. Their logistics model delivered independence. Their tactics delivered battlefield dominance. And their reputation delivered psychological collapse. It looked unstoppable because, in the environments they had mastered, the wide-open grasslands of Eurasia, it practically was. But systems that are optimized for one environment can become fragile in another. The Mongol machine ran on mobility, and mobility depended on terrain, fodder, and space. As long as those variables aligned, they were unmatched. The question no one had fully tested yet was simple: what happens when they don't? If the Mongols represented the most efficient war machine of the 13th century, the Mamluks were something far stranger and far more dangerous than they appeared at first glance. The word Mamluk literally means owned or slave in Arabic. On paper, they were property. In practice, they became one of the most formidable military elites of the medieval world. The system worked like this: young boys, often of Turkic or Caucasian origin from the Eurasian steppe, were purchased or captured and brought to Egypt. They were cut off from their families, converted to Islam, and placed into an intensive military training pipeline. For years, sometimes decades, they trained relentlessly in horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, wrestling, and tactics. They memorized religious texts. They learned discipline, loyalty, and above all, cohesion. This wasn't feudal Europe, where knights fought for personal glory under loosely coordinated banners. The Mamluks were shaped inside a controlled institutional environment. Their identity was forged through shared hardship and education. They weren't bound by tribal loyalty, they were bound by brotherhood and the system that had elevated them. And here's the twist that makes them so important in this story: many of them came from the same broad steppe culture as the Mongols. They understood mounted warfare instinctively. They were not sedentary infantry trying to survive against fast cavalry. They were professional horsemen who had grown up in similar landscapes. In many ways, they were a mirror image, steppe warriors trained within a centralized state. By 1250, the Mamluks had overthrown their former Ayyubid masters in Egypt and established their own sultanate. The slaves had become rulers. It was one of the most improbable power transitions in medieval history. When the Mongols advanced west after destroying Baghdad and taking Damascus, Egypt stood as the last major Muslim power in the region. If it fell, there would be no serious barrier between the Mongol armies and North Africa. The psychological pressure alone was immense. At the center of Egypt's response stood Sultan Qutuz. Qutuz was not born into comfort. As a child, he had been captured during Mongol campaigns in Central Asia and sold into slavery. He rose through the Mamluk ranks through competence, resilience, and calculated ruthlessness. By 1259, he had seized power in Egypt. Unlike many rulers watching events from a safe distance, Qutuz had personal reasons to understand what Mongol conquest meant. He had seen its consequences up close. When Hulagu Khan sent envoys to Cairo demanding submission, the message followed the established Mongol formula: submit, and you may survive under our authority. Resist, and you will be annihilated. The letter emphasized inevitability. It invoked past victories. It framed conquest as destiny. For most rulers facing that ultimatum, the rational response, at least in the short term, was compliance. Survival under vassal status could be justified as strategic patience. After all, Baghdad had fallen. Damascus had opened its gates. Who was Egypt to imagine it would fare better? Qutuz made a different calculation. He ordered the Mongol envoys executed and had their heads displayed publicly in Cairo. It was an unmistakable declaration of war. In modern strategic terms, it was a signal that Egypt would not negotiate from a position of fear. But it was also a gamble. What made that gamble plausible was timing. In 1259, the great Khan monk died while campaigning in China. His death triggered a succession crisis. According to Mongol law, princes of the royal family were required to return to participate in selecting the next great Khan. Hulagu withdrew much of his massive army eastward to secure his political position. He left behind a reduced force in Syria under his trusted general Kitbuka. Estimates vary, but modern historians suggest this rearguard numbered perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 Mongol cavalry, along with allied contingents from Armenia and Georgia. Still formidable, but not the overwhelming juggernaut that had crushed Baghdad. Qutuz recognized the window. If he waited, Hulagu could return with reinforcements. If he surrendered, Egypt would lose autonomy permanently. But if he moved quickly, he could confront a divided Mongol force before it regained full strength. There was another complication: geography and politics. To reach the Mongol position in Palestine, the Mamluk army would have to pass through territory controlled by the Crusader states, longtime enemies who had fought Muslim powers for generations. Under normal circumstances, such cooperation would have been unthinkable. But the strategic landscape had shifted. The Crusaders had seen Mongol power firsthand. Some of their cities had been threatened. They understood that if Egypt fell, they would be next. So an extraordinary arrangement emerged. The Mamluks were allowed safe passage through Crusader-held territory. Supply bases were tolerated. Old enemies chose pragmatism over ideology. It was a classic case of the enemy of my enemy. Into this moment stepped another key figure, Baybars. Baybars was a Mamluk commander of exceptional ability and ambition. Like many of his peers, he had risen from slavery through talent and discipline. He was tactically sharp, politically shrewd, and deeply aware of his own potential. Years earlier, during a period of internal conflict, Baybars had spent time in Syria and Palestine. He knew the terrain. He had ridden through the valleys, studied the hills, and understood where cavalry could maneuver and where it could not. That local knowledge would prove decisive. If Qutuz provided the political will to resist, Baybars provided operational insight. Together, they were not improvising from desperation. They were analyzing the system. They understood Mongol tactics. They understood mounted warfare. And crucially, they recognized that the Mongol advantage was not universal, it was environmental. The Mamluks were not naive underdogs hoping for a miracle. They were professionals who believed they could disrupt a dominant system by changing the context of the fight. When they marched north in 1260, they did so fully aware of the risk. They were facing a military brand that had crushed kingdoms across continents. But they were also facing a temporary vulnerability, a reduced force, stretched supply lines, and unfamiliar terrain. For the first time in decades, the Mongols were about to encounter an opponent who understood both their playbook and the ground beneath their hooves. If the Mongol advantage was mobility, then the counter to that advantage wasn't bigger armies or better speeches. It was friction. And friction, in this case, came from something deceptively mundane, the ground itself. On the Eurasian steppe, Mongol horses thrived. The soil was soft, the grass abundant, the terrain wide and forgiving. Their small, tough ponies had evolved for exactly that ecosystem. They rarely needed horseshoes. The ground hardened their hooves naturally, and the endless grazing supported the massive remount system that made Mongol armies so fast. Syria and Palestine were different. This landscape was broken, rocky hills, limestone outcroppings, hard-packed earth. Repeated movement over this terrain without protective iron shoes damaged hooves. Cracks formed. Bruising set in. A horse with compromised hooves doesn't just slow slightly, it becomes less stable, less maneuverable, more prone to stumbling. Over days and weeks of campaigning, that degradation compounds. The Mamluks, by contrast, had operated in this region for generations. Their horses were shod with iron horseshoes, designed specifically to protect against abrasive, uneven ground. It seems like a minor technical detail. It wasn't. On rocky slopes and narrow valleys, that difference translated into stability, endurance, and confidence at speed. Then there was the issue of grass. The Mongol system depended on numbers of horses that most sedentary states couldn't even imagine maintaining. If a cavalry force of 15,000 Mongols rode with 3 horses each, that meant 45,000 animals grazing daily. Each horse required roughly 8 to 10 pounds of fodder per day at minimum. That adds up to hundreds of thousands of pounds of grass every 24 hours. The steppe could handle that. Northern Syria could not. The Levant was semi-arid. It had fertile pockets, yes, but not endless seas of grass stretching to the horizon. Sustaining large concentrations of remount strained the ecosystem quickly. Overgrazing reduced available fodder. Horses weakened. The very mechanism that enabled Mongol operational speed, their multi-horse system, became harder to maintain at scale. The Mamluks understood this constraint. In some areas, they reportedly employed scorched earth tactics, burning or stripping grazing land to deny it to the Mongols. It was an early form of resource denial strategy. They couldn't outnumber the Mongols on open plains, but they could make the plains less useful. In modern strategic terms, they attacked the supply side of the Mongol business model. Now layer geography on top of that. The Jezreel Valley in northern Palestine is a broad, triangular plain that historically served as a corridor between Syria and Egypt. Armies moving south naturally passed through it. At first glance, it looked ideal for Mongol warfare, open enough for cavalry maneuvers, flat enough for speed. But the valley wasn't an endless plain. It was bordered by hills. Mount Gilboa rose to the south. The hills of Lower Galilee framed the north. Other elevations closed in toward the east. And near a spring called Ain Jalut, the valley narrowed. The open space compressed into a more constrained corridor. That narrowing was critical. To a commander obsessed with mobility, the Jezreel Valley would appear inviting. To someone studying its contours carefully, it looked like a funnel. Baybar saw that funnel. He understood that Mongol tactics required space, room to feign retreat, wheel around, encircle, disengage. In a confined area bordered by elevations and broken terrain, those maneuvers became riskier. Horses struggling with rocky ground would have less room to recover formation. Units stretched out in pursuit could be isolated. Ain Jalut itself sat near a spring, one of the few reliable water sources in the area. Armies gravitated toward water. It was a natural magnet. But it was also positioned near one of the valley's tighter sections, where hills closed in from multiple sides. From those hills, concealed forces could observe movement on the valley floor without being easily detected. This is where the architecture of the ambush took shape. The plan was not to meet the Mongols head-on in a conventional clash. That would have played directly into their strengths. Instead, the Mamluks divided their force. A smaller vanguard, under Baybars, would position itself visibly in the valley. Its job was not to win immediately. Its job was to engage, provoke, and retreat. The bulk of the army, commanded by Sultan Qutuz, would remain hidden in the surrounding hills, shielded by trees, rocks, and elevation. From those positions, they could observe the Mongol advance and wait for the right moment. It was a calculated inversion of the Mongol playbook. The Mongols had built their reputation on drawing enemies into traps through feigned retreats. Here, the Mamluks would become the bait. Baybar's forward force would skirmish, fire arrows, appear pressured, and then withdraw deliberately deeper into the narrowing valley. The Mongols, confident in decades of successful pursuit, would interpret that withdrawal as collapse. But pursuit in a narrowing valley is different from pursuit on open steppe. As Mongol cavalry advanced, their formations would elongate. Units would chase at slightly different speeds. Command cohesion would thin. The hills, once irrelevant background, would transform into concealed launch points. When the majority of the Mongol force committed to the chase and entered the choke point, the hidden Mamluk main force would descend from multiple sides. The terrain would eliminate the Mongols' greatest advantages, lateral maneuver space and flexible retreat routes. The rocky slopes would punish unshod hooves during sudden turns and uphill charges. And the compressed battlefield would neutralize some of the speed differential that had made Mongol armies so lethal in open country. None of this required a technological breakthrough. No revolutionary weapon. Just an acute understanding of constraints. Horseshoes versus bare hooves. Semi-arid grazing limits versus steppe abundance. A valley that narrows instead of stretches endlessly. A spring that pulls armies toward a predictable point. It was death by detail. The Mongol system was optimized for scale and motion. The Mamluk counterstrategy was optimized for compression and control. They weren't trying to overpower the Mongols at their peak. They were trying to change the environment so that peak performance was impossible. At Ain Jalut, the battlefield wasn't chosen randomly. It was engineered. And in that engineering lay the twist. The empire that had mastered mobility was about to be trapped by geography, logistics, and a few inches of iron nailed beneath a horse's hoof. At dawn on September 3, 1260, the Jezreel Valley looked deceptively calm. A thin morning light stretched across the plain, casting long shadows toward the west. Baybars and his forward cavalry waited in the open, visible enough to be noticed, small enough to seem manageable. Behind them, hidden among rocky slopes and scattered trees, the main Mamluk force held its breath. When Kitbuka's Mongol army approached from the north, confidence was on their side. They had broken empires. They had seen cities surrender without a fight. A Mamluk force standing in the open valley must have looked like an overdue submission, finally, a decisive engagement. The first clashes were sharp but controlled. Baybars pushed his cavalry forward in aggressive bursts, loosing arrows, testing the Mongol line, then pulling back before close combat could fully develop. It was provocation by design. Enough pressure to irritate. Not enough to commit. There was another subtle edge working in his favor. The Mongols were advancing eastward into the rising sun. Morning glare reduced contrast, blurred movement, and made it harder to read distance and formation changes. It wasn't a dramatic disadvantage, but in battle, small distortions accumulate. A fraction of a second slower to identify a maneuver. A slightly misjudged distance. Over time, those margins matter. For hours, the skirmishing continued. The Mongols responded in kind, firing their composite bows with deadly precision. But Baybars refused to be pinned down. His units advanced, withdrew, and repositioned in controlled arcs. To Kitbuka, it likely appeared as resistance cracking under sustained pressure. Then came the pivot. At a prearranged signal, the Mamluks broke formation and began to retreat southward, deeper into the valley. Not a panicked flight, an organized withdrawal that looked chaotic from a distance. Dust kicked up. Riders turned. The line stretched. This was the Mongols' favorite scenario. An enemy breaking under pressure. A pursuit that would turn into annihilation. Kitbuka committed. Mongol cavalry surged forward, accelerating into the chase. The valley ahead seemed open enough, and the promise of total victory was too tempting to ignore. As they pressed south, the terrain subtly shifted. The wide plain narrowed. Hills crept closer on both sides. The pursuing force elongated, units moving at slightly different speeds, cohesion thinning in the adrenaline of the moment. From above, Sultan Qutuz watched. Timing was everything. Spring the trap too early and the Mongols could disengage. Wait too long and Baybar's vanguard could be overwhelmed. As the bulk of the Mongol force poured into the constricted section near Ain Jalut, the window opened. The signal was given. The hills erupted. From both flanks, and from the rear elevations, Mamluk cavalry and infantry surged downward. War cries echoed across stone and scrub. What moments earlier had looked like a collapsing enemy now became a tightening ring. To their credit, the Mongols reacted with discipline. These were not inexperienced soldiers. They attempted to will their formations, to create defensive cohesion, to re-establish lines of fire. But maneuvering in a narrowing valley bordered by elevation is not the same as maneuvering on open steppe. The rocky terrain that had been a mild irritation during the approach now became a liability. Mongol ponies, unshod and already stressed by weeks of movement over hard ground, struggled on uneven slopes. Hooves slipped on loose stones. Sudden turns cost balance. Charging uphill under pressure exposed riders to concentrated arrow fire. Mamluk horses, protected by iron shoes, descended the slopes with greater stability. Gravity amplified their charge. Momentum favored them in close quarters. Then another unexpected element entered the field: sound. The Mamluks deployed early hand cannons, crude gunpowder devices known as midfa. They were primitive, inaccurate, and limited in destructive power. But their psychological impact was disproportionate. The explosive crack and burst of smoke were unlike anything Mongol horses had encountered. War horses are trained to endure chaos, screams, clashing steel, the shock of impact. But gunpowder introduced a new sensory disruption. Some horses reared. Others bolted. Even brief disorder at the animal level fractured formation integrity. In a battle defined by momentum and coordination, that disruption mattered. The fight devolved into brutal close combat. Arrows gave way to lances and blades. Mamluk heavy cavalry, with thicker armor and larger mounts, pressed into the melee. For the first time in decades, a Mongol force found itself compressed, attacked from multiple directions, and denied room to reset. Yet the outcome was not inevitable. At one critical moment, Mongol units managed to break through the Mamluk left flank. The line wavered. If they could punch a corridor through the encirclement, they might regain open ground and reconstitute their mobility advantage. The entire battle hung in that gap. Kutuz made his move. Removing his helmet so his face could be seen clearly, he rode directly into the threatened sector. In medieval combat, visibility was leadership. Soldiers needed to see their commander physically present. By exposing himself, Kutuz signaled absolute commitment. According to chroniclers, he shouted for his troops to stand firm and fight for their faith and survival. The effect was immediate. Fresh reserves surged into the breach. The wavering flank stabilized. The Mongol breakthrough stalled and was forced back. Then another fracture appeared, this one political. Some of the auxiliary Syrian troops fighting alongside the Mongols had little loyalty to their overlords. As the battle turned and the myth of Mongol invincibility visibly cracked, their calculus shifted. Defection became survival. Several contingents switched sides, attacking the Mongols from within the broader formation. Now the Mongol force faced pressure not only from the hills but from instability inside its own ranks. Kidbuka refused to flee. He continued fighting even as cohesion collapsed around him. Eventually, his horse was struck and he was thrown to the ground. Accounts vary on the exact sequence, but he was either killed in the melee or captured and brought before Kutuz. In either case, he was executed. With their commander dead, organized resistance crumbled. The retreat turned chaotic. Mongol riders attempted to escape northward, but the same terrain that had enabled the ambush now magnified the collapse. Narrow passages clogged with fleeing cavalry. Damaged hooves slowed escape. Mamluk forces pursued relentlessly, pressing the advantage across ground they understood better. What began as a confident advance ended in a rout. By the end of the day, thousands of Mongol warriors lay dead in the valley. For the first time in over half a century, a Mongol field army had been decisively defeated in open battle, and it would not immediately return to reverse the outcome. The myth had fractured. Not because the Mongols lacked courage or skill. They fought fiercely. They adapted as best they could. But at Ain Jalut, their system met constraints it could not overcome. Speed was compressed. Mobility was trapped. Psychology flipped. In that rocky valley, the most feared war machine of its age discovered that dominance is contextual, and that even the fastest empire can be cornered when the ground itself turns against it. In the immediate aftermath of Ain Jalut, the message was unmistakable. Kitbuka's head was sent to Cairo and displayed publicly, the same city where Mongol envoys had once issued threats with total confidence. The psychological shock rippled across the region. Damascus was retaken within days. Aleppo followed. For the first time in a generation, the Mongol advance had not just stalled, it had reversed. But history rarely offers clean endings. Just weeks after the victory, Sultan Qutuz was assassinated during a hunting expedition, likely orchestrated by Baybars, the very general who had helped design the winning strategy. Power shifted again. Yet under Baybar's rule, the Mamluk Sultanate consolidated its strength, pushed back Crusader strongholds, and secured the region for decades. Meanwhile, the Mongols, fractured by internal civil war and constrained by the same environmental limits that doomed them at Ain Jalut, never fully reclaimed the Levant. Zoom out, and the lesson is bigger than one battle. If the Mongols had taken Egypt, the political and economic future of the Mediterranean might have looked very different. But they didn't. Not because they were weaker soldiers, but because their system hit its environmental ceiling. Strategy beats size when it understands context. Logistics beats legend. And advantages only matter when the terrain supports them. If you've ever built something, whether it's a company, a creative brand, or a career, you know the environment can amplify or crush your strengths. So here's my question, where is your Ain Jalut? Where does your competition look unstoppable until the terrain shifts? If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe for more stories where strategy, geography, and overlooked details change history. Like the video, share it with someone who loves big turning points, and remember, terrain is destiny.